Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The quiet streets of Gettysburg had never known war, yet on this summer day they became its unwilling stage. A woman stood at her window folding bandages, her home transformed into an improvised hospital like so many others in town. Union soldiers rushed past with urgent determination, the thunder of boots echoing against brick walls, while the scent of gunpowder drifted through broken doorways. Then a wild bullet cracked the glass beside her, a reminder that the battle was no longer distant. It was inside the town itself. Residents who only days earlier spoke of harvests and markets now whispered prayers over wounded strangers laid out across kitchen tables. Some treated Union boys, others Confederate, because suffering erased uniforms faster than ideology. Outside, the fleeing Union rearguard tried to form a desperate skirmish line as Confederate troops rounded the corner, gray coats sweeping forward like a tide. In these narrow streets, Billy Yank and Johnny Reb clashed not on open fields, but among picket fences, church steps, and the familiar landmarks of civilian life. To the people of Gettysburg, the war had abruptly become personal, its violence no longer held at arm's length by newspaper print or distant rumors. The sounds of battle, musket fire, frantic shouts, clattering hooves, mingled with the cries of the wounded carried through open windows. Civilians crouched in basements and attics, unsure whether dawn would bring safety or deeper terror. Above it all hung a grim truth. This was no ordinary skirmish, but the beginning of a struggle whose outcome would decide the fate of a nation. And yet no general had chosen Gettysburg for destiny. The armies converged almost by accident, drawn by roads, supplies, and misread intentions, as if history itself had selected the town for its crossroads. What began as scattered shots and startled encounters was swelling into the bloodiest battle the continent had ever seen. The woman at the window could not know it, but the fields and ridges beyond her street would soon be etched into memory, myth, and mourning. Gettysburg was no longer a town on a map. It was becoming a turning point in the American story. By the summer of 1863, the United States stood on a knife's edge, its future uncertain, and its identity unresolved. The Civil War had already consumed thousands of lives, scorched towns, and torn families apart, yet neither side seemed able to deliver a decisive blow. In the South, confidence swelled as Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia secured victory after victory, raising hopes that the Confederacy might force the Union to accept independence. Lee believed that one bold movement into the North could tip the balance and change the course of the war itself. So the Confederacy marched northward, crossing the Potomac and entering Pennsylvania, a state untouched by the ravages of war until now. Lee hoped to threaten Washington, Baltimore, and even Philadelphia, forcing Northern politicians and civilians to taste fear for the first time. If panic spread and Northern morale fractured, peace might come not through battlefield triumph, but through political exhaustion. His men, hardened by earlier campaigns, carried with them both confidence and the belief that destiny favored their cause. Opposing them was the Army of the Potomac, still shaken from its devastating defeat at Chancellorsville only weeks earlier. Command had just passed to Major General George Meade, a quiet but capable leader thrust into responsibility on the eve of crisis. Meade inherited an army of more than 93,000 soldiers, large but demoralized, tasked with the urgent pursuit of Lee's 70,000 veterans. The Union Army shadowed the Confederates northward, skirmishing at crossroads and river crossings, knowing that a full-scale battle was inevitable. As the two armies moved deeper into Pennsylvania, uncertainty clouded their movements like summer haze. Neither commander knew precisely where the other stood, and scouts brought conflicting reports from dusty roads and scattered farms. For civilians across the North, the war that had once seemed distant was now approaching their own barns, fields, and churchyards. The possibility that the Confederacy might not only survive but invade northern soil sent ripples of fear through towns unprepared for war. Both armies sensed that the next battle would carry enormous weight, but neither knew where it would erupt. The rolling hills and crossroads around Gettysburg appeared ordinary, a place passed through rather than remembered. Yet fate, marching with the armies, was about to choose this quiet town as the crucible where the nation's future would be tempered in blood. What happened next would transform strategy into legend and uncertainty into destiny, as the armies drew ever closer to a collision neither side had intended but neither could avoid. On June 30th, as the Confederate advance pushed deeper into Pennsylvania, a brigade from A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps approached Gettysburg in search of supplies rumored to be stored in town. When Confederate scouts spotted Union cavalry there, they assumed it was merely a small militia detachment offering no real threat. The report was carried back toward Cashtown, but Henry Heth, one of Hill's divisional commanders, dismissed the warning. Convinced the Federals were few and inconsequential, he persuaded Hill to send 2 divisions toward Gettysburg the following day to sweep them aside and seize the needed goods. What neither Heth nor Hill realized was that these cavalrymen were no scattered locals but advance elements of the Army of the Potomac under the famous John Buford. These Union horsemen understood the stakes instantly and held their ground, using their carbines to delay the Confederates and buy precious time. They sent urgent calls for reinforcements, knowing that if the Confederates controlled the town and the surrounding high ground, the Union Army would be forced to attack uphill at terrible cost. In the rising summer heat, the first shots cracked across the ridges outside Gettysburg, and the battle began not by strategic design, but by miscalculation and chance. As both sides pressed forward, the encounter escalated rapidly from a reconnaissance probe into a full engagement. The Confederates pushed toward the town expecting an easy victory, only to find stubborn resistance from cavalrymen fighting dismounted behind fences and stone walls. Dust rose from the roads as more Union troops approached, answering Buford's plea for support, while Confederate columns continued to arrive in growing numbers. What had begun as a mission to gather supplies was now swelling into a confrontation neither army had planned, yet both were being drawn into by momentum and necessity. This accidental collision was a reminder of how war often turns on the smallest misunderstandings. A report dismissed, a force underestimated, a town chosen for shoes rather than strategy. These were the sparks that ignited the opening of the largest battle ever fought on American soil. The fields west of Gettysburg, quiet only hours earlier, now echoed with musket volleys and shouted commands as Union and Confederate troops fought for position. Neither Lee nor Meade had envisioned this town as the place where their armies would clash. Yet the roads that converged there pulled both forces toward it like threads tightening in a knot. By nightfall on June 30th, neither side truly understood how significant the coming day would be. The Confederates believed they still faced militia. The Union believed they were merely delaying a probing force. Yet as more brigades marched through the darkness toward Gettysburg, the stage was being set for a struggle that would determine not just control of a town, but the fate of a divided nation. The battle had found Gettysburg, and there would be no turning back. At dawn on July the 1st, the crack of rifle fire west of Gettysburg signaled that the Confederate advance had collided with Union resistance. Buford's cavalry, still outnumbered, fought hard to slow the enemy and hold the ridges long enough for infantry to arrive. Their defense bought the precious minutes necessary for the Union First Corps to reach the field, marching with urgency toward the sound of battle. At their head rode General John F. Reynolds, one of the Union Army's most respected commanders, determined to seize the high ground before the Confederates could take it. Reynolds quickly assessed the situation and took personal control, recognizing that if the ridges were lost, the entire Union Army would be forced to fight at a disadvantage. He ordered the famed Iron Brigade into McPherson's woods, their tall black hats and disciplined ranks marking them as some of the toughest soldiers in the Union Army. These men pushed into the trees and met the Confederates at close range, trading volleys among the shadows of the forest. The fighting was fierce and intimate, branches splintering under musket fire as the woods became a deadly maze of smoke and shouting. For a brief moment, Union momentum surged as the Iron Brigade held firm and other Federal units took up positions along the ridges. But in the chaos of issuing orders and directing his men, Reynolds was struck by a bullet and fell from his horse, killed instantly. His death rippled through the lines, stunning soldiers who had looked to him for steadiness in the opening hours of the battle. Leaders rushed to fill the void, yet the loss cast a shadow over the Union effort, even as the fight continued to expand. Despite the shock, Union forces fought to maintain the defensive line as more Confederate troops arrived to reinforce their attack. The Iron Brigade, bloodied but unbroken, became the anchor of the Union stand, their determination slowing the Confederate advance long enough for additional Federal units to reach the battlefield. Around them, the ridges and fields filled with smoke, and the once quiet landscape transformed into a battleground claimed at tremendous cost. What had begun as a struggle for time was becoming a fight for survival. By late morning, both sides understood that the confrontation outside Gettysburg was no passing encounter, but the beginning of something far larger. The Union line strained under mounting pressure, yet it still held, shaped by Reynolds's final decisions and the Iron Brigade's relentless defense. The battle's first hours had already taken a heavy toll, and the day was far from over. As more troops marched toward Gettysburg, the fight that neither army had planned was accelerating toward a scale that neither could yet imagine. As midday passed on July the 1st, the Union forces braced against mounting pressure from the west and northwest. Reinforcements from the 11th Corps arrived to bolster the defense, but they had little time to settle before fresh Confederate divisions swept onto the field. The Federals were stretched thin across a broad front, their lines bending under the weight of growing Confederate numbers. What had begun as a desperate effort to delay the enemy was becoming a struggle simply to avoid being overwhelmed in place. The Confederates intensified their assaults, focusing especially on the northern flank where the 11th Corps held exposed ground. Their formations pressed forward in coordinated waves, exploiting gaps and forcing Union units to fall back or risk annihilation. The disparity in numbers became increasingly apparent. 17 Confederate brigades now bore down with close to 27,000 men, while barely 22,000 Federals struggled to hold across an increasingly fragile line. The Union defenders fought bravely, but the position was untenable, and the strain on their ranks grew toward breaking point. By mid-afternoon, the pressure finally shattered the Union position. The northern flank collapsed, triggering a cascading retreat that rippled across the entire line. Soldiers fell back through the streets of Gettysburg, some fleeing in panic while others conducted a fighting withdrawal, firing from alleyways and doorways to slow the Confederate advance. Civilians ducked for cover as the tide of blue uniforms surged past, the fighting spilling into gardens, porches, and narrow lanes. The town that had awakened to quiet streets was now a funnel of chaos and desperation. Yet even with the Union Army in retreat, the Confederates halted their pursuit northeast of town. Generals Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, both cautious and awaiting reinforcements, chose not to press the attack onto the high ground south of Gettysburg. The ridges, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the heights beyond, lay within reach, their capture potentially decisive. But Robert E. Lee had instructed Ewell to take the heights only if practicable, and Ewell judged that his exhausted men could not drive the Federals from such strong terrain. That single hesitation became one of the most debated decisions of the war. As the sun dipped lower, the last Union soldiers reached the relative safety of the hills and began organizing a new defensive line. Their retreat had been costly and chaotic, but they now held ground that would prove pivotal in the days ahead. Historians still debate what might have unfolded had Ewell seized the heights that evening, whether the Union Army could have regrouped, whether the battle might have ended before it truly began. What remains certain is that the Confederates stopped short, and the Federals lived to fight again, preparing to defend the elevated ground that would define the next 2 days of brutal combat. As the fighting faded on the evening of July 1st, Gettysburg lay bruised and trembling beneath drifting smoke. The Union Army, battered and driven from the town, gathered on the heights south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the rocky rise of Culp's Hill. What had been a frantic retreat now transformed into a hurried fortification effort as weary soldiers dug in, stacked rifles, and prepared for renewed assault. They understood that these elevations were the key to survival, and holding them meant the battle was far from lost. In the town below, the echoes of combat lingered in shattered windows and blood-stained doorways. Civilians moved cautiously through their darkened homes, tending to the wounded and listening for renewed gunfire. Some prayed over strangers lying on parlor floors, while others hid in cellars, unsure which uniforms would next cross their thresholds. The day had brought fear, but night carried its own dread. Silence that could break at any moment. Up on the heights, Union commanders took stock of their position and realized its strategic power. The defensive line forming along the ridges curved inward like a fishhook, compact and anchored on strong terrain that offered overlapping fields of fire. Officers moved along the slopes in the dimming light, encouraging their men and pointing out where artillery would soon be placed. Many soldiers sensed that if they could hold here, the tide might yet turn in their favor. Meanwhile, the Confederates remained north and west of the town, victorious but uncertain. They had driven the Federals from the fields and streets, yet the high ground stood unconquered, looming like a missed opportunity. Campfires flickered as officers debated whether they should have pressed the advantage before nightfall, voices low but tinged with frustration. The moment had slipped away, and with it the chance to claim a position that Lee knew could determine the outcome of the campaign. Casualties from the first day already exceeded 15,000, a grim prelude to the slaughter yet to come. Both sides tended to wounded under the fading light, the agonized cries drifting across the valley between them. Soldiers on the heights peered into the darkness, expecting the Confederates to storm the slopes at any moment, while those in gray whispered that the Federals would flee by dawn. Neither prediction would prove true. As night settled fully over Gettysburg, an uneasy stillness took hold, broken only by distant moans and the clink of entrenching tools. The battle that neither side had planned was rapidly becoming a struggle neither could escape, drawn onward by momentum, pride, and fate. The heights were now the anchor of the Union defense, and the Confederates would have to wrench them loose if they hoped to win. With dawn would come reinforcements, new orders, and the next chapter in the fight for a nation's future. When dawn broke on July 2nd, the Union Army was no longer a scattered force clinging to survival. It was assembling into a formidable defensive position. Through the night, corps after corps arrived and settled into the elevated terrain south of town, forming a strong line along Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Additional troops secured Culp's Hill on the right and extended the line toward Little Round Top on the left, creating a defensive arc that curved like a massive fishhook. Major General George Meade now had 6 of his 7 corps on the field, and though the troops were weary, the ground beneath them offered a tremendous advantage. The terrain was nearly perfect for defense, with gentle slopes that forced attackers uphill and allowed artillery to command open fields of fire. Officers quickly recognized that if the line held, the Union Army could absorb even the fiercest assault and bleed the enemy dry. Meade moved calmly among his subordinates, issuing clear instructions and assessing vulnerabilities, his quiet demeanor masking the immense weight upon him. He had been in command for less than a week, yet the fate of the Union war effort now rested on his judgment and resolve. Across the way, Robert E. Lee surveyed the same landscape and saw opportunity rather than obstacle. The Confederates had driven the Federals from the town, but the high ground remained unconquered, and Lee believed that a decisive strike could still break the Union Army. He resolved to attack again, convinced that his men, victorious so often before, could shatter the Federal line and force a retreat that might end the war. But with the Union right anchored firmly on steep, fortified slopes, Lee directed his attention to the opposite flank instead. Lee conceived a bold plan. While Ewell demonstrated against the Union right at Culp's Hill to hold those defenders in place, the main assault would hammer the Union left. If his forces could roll up the Union line from the south, they could seize supply routes, disrupt communication, and collapse Meade's army from the flank inward. To execute this maneuver, Lee turned to his trusted lieutenant, General James Longstreet, whose corps would spearhead the attack. The plan depended on timing, coordination, and surprise, qualities difficult to command on a battlefield already surging with movement. As preparations unfolded, couriers rode back and forth, artillery repositioned, and Confederate divisions readied for the advance. But delays crept into the execution, and the morning hours slipped away as Longstreet's troops attempted to maneuver unseen around the Union flank. Dust clouds, narrow roads, and Union observers on high ground complicated their approach, and Lee's intended early assault drifted into afternoon. Meanwhile, Union forces continued strengthening their positions, unaware of the full scope of the storm gathering to the south. By midday, tension thickened across the battlefield as both armies braced for the next stage of combat. The Union line stood strong but untested in its new formation, its soldiers digging in and watching the ridges and woods before them with anticipation. The Confederates, confident yet constrained by terrain and timing, prepared to strike with devastating force. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and costly assaults of the war, one that would test leadership, endurance, and the very structure of the Union line. Yet fate was preparing one more twist, one that neither Lee nor Meade could see from their headquarters. A single decision by a Union Corps commander, made without orders and driven by personal judgment, would reshape the battlefield and nearly unravel the Union position before the Confederates even attacked. The defensive fishhook was strong, but its left flank was about to shift, and with it, the course of the second day at Gettysburg. As the Union line settled into place on July 2nd, one section of the defense remained stable only in appearance. General Daniel Sickles, commander of the Union Third Corps, had been ordered to hold the lower end of Cemetery Ridge and anchor the left flank short of Little Round Top. But as he scanned the terrain before him, his eye fixed on a slight rise half a mile ahead, the peach orchard. To Sickles, that elevated ground seemed more advantageous than the assigned position, and he convinced himself that remaining where he was would invite disaster. Acting without approval from Meade, Sickles ordered his entire corps forward to occupy the peach orchard and extend his line outward into a pronounced salient. His troops stretched across a broad arc that exposed them to attack from multiple directions, creating a bulge in the Union formation that was difficult to reinforce and nearly impossible to defend. Officers questioned the movement, but Sickles insisted that the high ground must be held, trusting intuition over strategy. The fishhook shape of the Union line now had a weak protrusion, an unplanned flaw in an otherwise formidable defense. Unbeknownst to Sickles, his unauthorized advance placed his corps directly in the path of Lee's planned assault. Longstreet's troops, preparing to strike the Union left, now found their target pushed forward into terrain more favorable for attack. The Confederate assault that had once risked grinding uphill into fortified lines would instead smash into an exposed segment with open flanks. Sickles's decision, intended to strengthen the Union position, had instead created the most vulnerable point on the entire battlefield. As Union commanders realized what had happened, frustration rippled through headquarters. Meade rode to the peach orchard in disbelief, confronted by the sight of Sickles's corps dangling unsupported and dangerously stretched. He knew the position could not be easily withdrawn without triggering chaos, yet reinforcing it would drain strength from more critical sectors. The Union Army was now committed to defending a line it had never intended to occupy, reshaping the second day's battle before the first Confederate attack had even begun. Across the field, Confederate troops observed the shift with growing clarity. What they saw was not a coherent defensive line, but a tempting target, one that could be crushed, split, and rolled backward toward the heights. As artillery shifted and infantry prepared to advance, the landscape seemed to tilt in their favor. The battle for the Union left was no longer a test of terrain alone, but a struggle against the consequences of a single impulsive decision. The air thickened with anticipation as the afternoon sun climbed, casting long shadows over the orchards, wheat fields, and rocky slopes soon to be soaked in blood. Sickles's gamble was now set in motion, and the Union Army would have no choice but to fight desperately to prevent the collapse of its left flank. The Confederates were preparing to strike, and when they did, the peach orchard would become the hinge upon which the fate of the day, and perhaps the war, would swing. At around 4:00 p.m., Longstreet's assault crashed into the Union lower left with sudden ferocity, striking first at the rocky outcrop known as Devil's Den. Confederate brigades surged through the woods and crags, firing at close range as Union defenders struggled to hold ground without proper fortifications. The terrain itself seemed to conspire with the attackers, boulders, shadows, and twisted slopes turning the fight into a chaotic, intimate struggle fought face to face. Control of the hill shifted repeatedly as charges and countercharges drenched the rocks in smoke and blood. South of Devil's Den, the next wave of the Confederate attack swept toward Little Round Top, a hill whose strategic value was immediately apparent to anyone studying the field. The position was almost undefended when the Alabamians advanced, expecting to seize it with little resistance. But at the critical moment, a Union brigade under Colonel Strong Vincent arrived, rushing into formation under artillery fire and spreading thin across the rocky summit. The Confederates attacked with relentless determination, hurling themselves against the improvised Union line in repeated waves that threatened to break through. Along the extreme left flank, the 20th Maine under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain bore the brunt of the assaults, their ammunition dwindling as bodies piled among the trees. Exhaustion pressed on the defenders, and another Confederate charge seemed certain to shatter them and roll up the Union flank entirely. Recognizing that holding the hill meant preventing the enemy from circling behind the line, Chamberlain chose a desperate course of action. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge down the slope, a daring maneuver that stunned the advancing Confederates and sent them reeling back in disorder. Meanwhile, on the right side of Little Round Top, the Texas Brigade continued to press against outnumbered Union defenders, and Strong Vincent himself was mortally wounded while directing his troops. Just as the line threatened to collapse, fresh Union reinforcements arrived and launched a counterattack that forced the Texans to withdraw. Little Round Top was secured, but the cost had been immense, with the slopes littered by fallen soldiers and shattered equipment. Nearby, the Union troops at Devil's Den were ultimately forced to withdraw under relentless pressure, leaving the rocky ground in Confederate hands. Even so, the refusal of the Union flank to break proved decisive. By holding Little Round Top, the Federals prevented the Confederates from sweeping behind their lines and turning the entire position inside out. The bravery displayed in those brutal minutes, among stones, woods, and bloodied soil, became one of the battle's defining legends. As the smoke drifted from the slopes and the cries of the wounded echoed across the valley, it was clear that the fate of the Union Army had hung by the narrowest margin. While Little Round Top held, the fighting to the north intensified into some of the bloodiest combat of the entire battle. In the wheat field, Union and Confederate forces collided in a swirling contest where ground changed hands again and again. Maine volunteers fired from behind a low stone wall atop a slight rise, pouring volley after volley into advancing Confederates as the air thickened with powder and dust. Their stubborn stand slowed the rebel assault, but confusion among commanders and shifting orders left them isolated. When they finally withdrew, the hill fell into Confederate hands, only to be contested once more by arriving Union reinforcements. The wheat field became a butchered patch of earth where no side could claim victory, only survival. To the north, the peach orchard, created by Sickles' unauthorized advance, now became the hinge of the battle. Kershaw's South Carolinians wheeled unexpectedly, exposing their flank to Union fire and taking heavy losses in the exchange. But as Union troops turned to exploit their advantage, they revealed their own vulnerability. Fresh Confederate brigades struck from the north, collapsing the exposed line and forcing the defenders to retreat in disorder. The salient Sickles had created now buckled under the combined weight of converging assaults, leaving the peach orchard firmly in Confederate hands and the Union position dangerously compromised. Back in the wheat field, each new reinforcement arrived only to be thrown into another maelstrom of smoke, blood, and broken formations. Union brigades surged forward to reclaim the ground, only to be flanked by Confederates emerging from Devil's Den. The fighting became a grinding storm of charges that led nowhere, except into deeper casualties. When the Confederates finally advanced through the field unopposed, they found themselves too exhausted and depleted to push farther, and a final Union counterattack sent them retreating. The ground they abandoned was slick with blood, marked by shattered rifles and silent forms sprawled among the trampled wheat. Meanwhile, Sickles himself paid the price for his gamble. A cannonball tore through his right leg, sending him to the rear while the Third Corps collapsed around the position he had chosen. The Corps was nearly destroyed, leaving a gaping vulnerability in the Union line. Confederate forces pressed toward Cemetery Ridge, the very center of the Federal position, threatening to punch through at the moment when Union strength seemed to waver. For an instant, it appeared the Confederate attack might achieve the breakthrough Lee sought. But General Winfield S. Hancock arrived, holding the Union center with calm determination. He gathered scattered units, redirected artillery, and steadied the men with his presence alone. Under his direction, reinforcements surged into the breach and repelled the Confederate assault before it could tear the Union line apart. Cemetery Ridge remained in Federal hands, but only narrowly, and only at tremendous cost. The center had bent under the weight of the day's attacks, yet it had not broken. As darkness descended on July the 2nd, the Union line still held, though bloodied and battered. The Third Corps lay shattered, the peach orchard lost, and the wheat field scarred by repeated slaughter. But the heights remained in Union control, and the Confederates had failed to dislodge them despite furious fighting. The second day had tested both armies to their limits, and the outcome remained uncertain. Yet one truth was becoming clear. The third day would decide far more than the fate of Gettysburg. It would decide the future direction of the war itself. As the fighting raged at the Peach Orchard and Wheat Field, a new threat emerged on the Union right. General Ewell escalated his diversionary bombardments into a full-scale assault on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, striking at positions that guarded the Union supply lines and the exposed flanks of their central defense. Only one brigade under General George Greene held Culp's Hill when the attack began, its 1,400 men spread thin across the wooded slopes. Yet they had spent the day building sturdy fortifications, and those hastily constructed defenses allowed them to withstand repeated Confederate charges in the fading light. The struggle for Culp's Hill unfolded in darkness, lit by muzzle flashes and the eerie glow of artillery fire. Confederate forces pressed hard, and though they failed to seize the summit, they captured abandoned fortifications on the lower slope when one of Greene's regiments was forced to withdraw. Meanwhile, Cemetery Hill came under attack from two Confederate brigades scaling its eastern rise, the defenders firing desperately to prevent a breakthrough that could shatter the Union line. The assaults were fierce, but the Federals held, preserving the vital anchor of their defensive formation even as casualties mounted in grim numbers. Elsewhere across the battlefield, the cost of the day's fighting became painfully clear. The Union Third Corps was effectively destroyed, its formation shattered, and its survivors scattered among other commands. General Daniel Sickles, whose unauthorized advance had reshaped the battle, was carried from the field after a cannonball tore away his right leg. His wounded limb would later be displayed in the Army Medical Museum, and Sickles himself would sometimes visit it, an unsettling reminder of how even vanity can leave a legacy carved in bone. By the time the guns fell silent, the second day of battle had claimed almost 10,000 Union casualties and around 7,000 Confederate dead and wounded. The fields, orchards, and rocky slopes were littered with abandoned equipment, shattered artillery, and the motionless forms of men who had charged or defended with equal conviction. Both armies dug in under cover of darkness, unsure whether dawn would bring renewed assault or long-awaited relief. Yet neither side showed signs of retreat, and commanders on both ridges understood that the coming day would decide everything. As midnight approached, the air hung thick with smoke, sorrow, and the distant cries of the wounded calling for water, prayer, or silence. The Federals still held the crucial high ground, but at terrible cost, and the Confederates believed they had come close to breaking the enemy line. The battle's outcome remained uncertain, and morale on both sides swayed in the darkness. The Union line had bent but not snapped, and the Confederates still searched for the decisive blow that might collapse it entirely. With the stars obscured by drifting powder haze, Gettysburg braced for a final day that would determine not just the fate of two armies, but the future of the nation they fought to define. At first light on July 3rd, the battle resumed before either army had truly recovered from the previous day's carnage. The Union, determined not to lose the ground seized by Greene's brigade, launched an artillery barrage and infantry assault to retake the lower slopes of Culp's Hill. What followed was the longest sustained fight of the entire battle, 7 relentless hours of musketry echoing through the timbered hillside. The Confederates clung fiercely to the captured works, but the fortified Union defenders eventually pushed them back, restoring the right flank and strengthening a position that could not be allowed to fall. The struggle on Culp's Hill reshaped the strategic landscape for the day. Lee had intended once again to press the Union left, hoping to reproduce the successes of July 2nd, but the renewed combat on the right shattered the timing and coordination required for such a maneuver. With Ewell's forces tied down and unable to shift, Lee was forced to reconsider his strategy entirely. His gaze turned toward the Union center on Cemetery Ridge, a position battered the previous afternoon and perceived as vulnerable, even though it now bristled with reinforced ranks and fresh artillery. As Confederate commanders conferred, Lee resolved upon a bold and decisive blow, a massive frontal assault aimed directly at the Federal center. He believed that if his men could pierce the ridge, the Union line would crack open and collapse inward, leading to a rout that could end the campaign, and perhaps the war itself. This plan required timing, courage, and an immense concentration of force, a gamble greater than any the Confederacy had yet attempted. Though his trusted subordinate James Longstreet objected, arguing the plan was too costly and uncertain, Lee remained determined. Meanwhile, the Union Army strengthened its interior lines, shifting reserves toward the center and ensuring that artillery covered every approach. General Winfield S. Hancock, already a key figure on July 2nd, oversaw the defensive preparations with calm authority. Soldiers along the ridge sensed that another major attack was coming and steadied themselves for whatever might follow. The sun rose higher, illuminating the rolling fields that stretched between the opposing lines, fields soon to be crossed by thousands of Confederate infantry under the eyes of both armies. To the east, another threat gathered in motion. General Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry, arriving late to the battlefield, prepared to swing around the Union rear to strike from behind at the critical moment. If Stuart succeeded while Lee's infantry drove into the center, the Union Army could be trapped, its retreat cut off, its defenses shattered. The plan was audacious, coordinated, and potentially devastating, provided that all elements struck in harmony. Yet harmony on a battlefield is fragile, easily broken by timing, terrain, or the uncertain wills of men. By late morning, the line stabilized, and the guns fell temporarily silent, creating an eerie calm across the blood-soaked fields. Both armies understood that the next movement would decide the day, and possibly the entire war. The Union held the high ground, but the Confederates retained belief, resolve, and momentum earned through past victories. As officers rode along the ranks and soldiers checked their weapons in tense anticipation, Gettysburg braced for the climactic moment. The Union center, battered yet unbroken, now stood as the target of the boldest assault Lee would ever order. By midday on July 3rd, Lee's plan for a massive assault on the Union center required more than infantry alone. To ensure success, Confederate cavalry under General Jeb Stuart moved east of Gettysburg, intending to swing around and strike the Union rear at the critical moment. If Stuart broke through, the Union forces defending Cemetery Ridge would find themselves attacked from both front and rear, their lines collapsing in confusion. But waiting for him was Union cavalry led by General David Gregg, positioned to guard against exactly such a maneuver. What began as scattered skirmishing soon erupted into a furious mounted battle, sabers flashing and pistols firing at point-blank range among the fields and fence lines. Stuart's men charged with the confidence of cavalry that had humiliated Union forces earlier in the war, but Gregg's troopers stood firm, bolstered by the arrival of Brigadier General George Custer and his Michigan Brigade. The combat surged back and forth in waves, horses rearing and men shouting as clouds of dust and powder choked the air. After 40 minutes of brutal fighting, Stuart's attack failed, forcing him to withdraw and leaving the Union rear secure at the decisive hour. While cavalry clashed to the east, the center of the battlefield prepared for one of the most terrifying artillery duels ever witnessed on the continent. Lee ordered every Confederate gun available, over 150 pieces, to bombard the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge, hoping to weaken their defenses before the infantry advanced. The Union responded with roughly 80 guns, and soon the field shook beneath the thunder of cannon fire that rolled across the valley like a continuous storm. Witnesses described the bombardment as the loudest man-made sound in North America up to that time, a roar so immense that it rattled windows miles away and left soldiers partially deafened. The ground convulsed under exploding shells, and smoke veiled the ridgeline until shapes and movements were swallowed by haze. Union infantry hugged the earth behind stone walls and breastworks, waiting out the inferno as shells burst above them, and iron fragments tore through ranks and equipment. Some batteries fell silent by design, conserving ammunition and encouraging the Confederates to believe they had knocked out more guns than they truly had. Across the fields, Confederate artillerists watched and listened, uncertain whether their bombardment had achieved the necessary damage to pave the way for the assault. As the cannonade tapered off and the smoke drifted in ragged sheets, a tense stillness descended over the battlefield. Officers along the Confederate lines prepared their troops, knowing that the most perilous phase of the plan was about to begin. Across the ridge, Union commanders scanned the open fields, aware that something momentous was coming, but unable to predict how or where the next blow would fall. The cavalry threat had been repelled, but the infantry attack, Lee's great gamble, still waited to be unleashed. In that moment of uneasy quiet, both armies seemed to hold their breath. Thousands of Confederate soldiers stood ready for the command to advance, while Union defenders tightened their grips on muskets and artillery lanyards. The outcome of the battle now rested on a single massive assault across open ground, a test of endurance, fire, and resolve. The cannon thunder had faded, the cavalry strike had failed, and the stage was now set for the most famous charge in American history. When the cannons fell silent at around 2 p.m., the order finally came. General James Longstreet, reluctant and grim, gave the signal for over 12,500 Confederate soldiers to step forward and begin the most daring assault of the war. 3 divisions, Pickett's fresh Virginians, along with Pettigrew's and Trimble's weary Carolinians and North Carolinians, formed their ranks in long, straight lines that stretched across the fields. As the drums beat and flags lifted into the drifting smoke, the men marched steadily toward Cemetery Ridge, knowing they faced nearly a mile of open ground under the enemy's gaze. Union artillery opened fire almost immediately, sending shells tearing through the advancing columns and leaving gaps that survivors closed with grim discipline. The Confederates pressed on, their formations rippling as cannon shot and exploding shells carved bloody paths through their ranks. When they drew closer, Union batteries on Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill joined the bombardment, enfilading the march from multiple angles and multiplying the devastation. Still the line advanced, flags waving defiantly above ranks thinned by every step. As they neared the ridge, the Confederate troops broke into a full charge, filling the air with the fierce rebel yell that had unnerved opponents on countless fields. At a curved stone wall known as the Angle, a portion of the Union line wavered under the sudden shock, and for a moment the Confederates surged through. They seized 2 Union cannons and attempted to turn them against their former owners, only to find that there was no ammunition left to fire. Reinforcements from nearby Union units rushed into the breach, pouring musket fire at close range and sealing the narrow rupture before it could widen. The Confederate assault faltered, then collapsed as momentum drained away under relentless rifle fire and bayonet counterattacks. Soldiers who had marched across the fields in orderly lines now staggered back in small groups, leaving the ground behind them strewn with fallen comrades. Less than half of those who began the charge returned to their own lines, and entire regiments were shattered beyond recognition. Longstreet watched in anguish, knowing he had sent his men into an attack he never believed could succeed. For the Confederacy, this moment became known as the high water mark, the furthest reach of their hopes, frozen in time at the crest of Cemetery Ridge. The Union line had held, and the great gamble had failed, leaving Lee's army battered and unable to launch another assault. Across the battlefield, the smoke lifted slowly, revealing a scene of terrible loss that neither side would ever forget. The outcome of the war was not yet decided, but Gettysburg had shifted its course, marking the beginning of the Confederacy's long retreat from the edge of possibility. After Pickett's charge collapsed, a heavy stillness settled over the battlefield, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant movement of stretcher parties. Lee prepared his remaining forces for a Union counterattack, expecting Meade to strike and complete the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia. But the Union troops were nearly as exhausted and bloodied as their opponents, and no assault came. As night approached, the once mighty Confederate army clung to its lines, shaken, diminished, and unable to continue the fight. At dawn on July 4th, rain fell softly over the fields where thousands of bodies lay motionless among trampled wheat and shattered fences. Lee ordered a withdrawal, and his army began slipping away from Gettysburg, moving southwest toward the mountains with wagon trains full of wounded stretching for miles. Union cavalry harried the retreat, but the main body of the Confederate army escaped, bruised yet not annihilated. The campaign that had begun with bold hope ended in quiet retreat, the dream of Northern victory fading into the muddy roads behind them. On the same day that Lee fell back from Gettysburg, another decisive event reshaped the war far to the west. At Vicksburg, the Confederate garrison surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and cutting the Confederacy in two. The coincidence of these two turning points, one in Pennsylvania, the other on the Mississippi, marked a profound shift in momentum. The Confederacy would fight on for nearly 2 more years, but never again would it stand poised to threaten the North so deeply or so confidently. The human cost of Gettysburg was staggering. Nearly a third of all soldiers engaged were killed, wounded, or missing, leaving families across both North and South to grieve sons, brothers, and fathers. Fields and orchards became open-air hospitals, and churches overflowed with the wounded as surgeons worked with grim efficiency. Months later, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate the soldiers' national cemetery. In a brief address, he spoke of the unfinished work of preserving the nation and affirmed the belief that all men are created equal. His words, spoken on ground still scarred by trenches and gun pits, transformed Gettysburg from a military victory into a national symbol. The sacrifices made there were bound to a larger purpose: the survival of democracy and the rebirth of the Union. Gettysburg did not end the war, but it ended the Confederacy's last best chance at victory through invasion and intimidation. From that moment forward, the South fought defensively, its resources dwindling while the North tightened its hold. The woman who once folded bandages in her shattered home could never have known how far the meaning of her town would reach. Gettysburg became not just a battlefield, but a turning point in the American story, a place where a nation's fate began to shift toward unity, memory, and eventual reconciliation.